Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome J.A. Dohm for our next panel.
Let me introduce myself to begin with. So I'm Jeffrey A. Dohm. I have written in the gaming industry. I've been a writer for about 15 years, but I had actually been in the gaming industry for more like, I want to say about 22, something like that. I've written, I would have to say, for about 7 or 8 different books, including 2 that I published myself. The first one and probably the one that's most noted that I had contributed to is Alderac Entertainment's World's Largest Dungeon. All right, this is something I commonly referred to as my Dungeons and Dragons dissertation. All right, where it was like 870 some odd pages of Dungeons and Dragons adventures. All right, and I did about 150 pages of this. So other things I've done more recently is Steam Fortress Victory. We published about 10 years ago. It's a steampunk role-playing game. And then the Vampires Codex is what we're most currently doing, all right? So this is 20 Eyes Entertainment in conjunction with Fifth Epic Publishing. General gist of Vampires Codex, it's sort of a dark history role-playing game where, it assumes that at some point or another, there had always been vampires around, and if you get old enough, you get to pull the strings on the world. So, and that's, kind of what the Vampires Codex is the actual recorded history versus what human recorded history is, okay? So, but that's not necessarily what I'm here for today. I'm here more to talk about how to build worlds, okay? So one of the most important things, and especially as I've gotten more into doing screenplays, and my first novel comes out in April, okay? As I've gotten into doing more screenplays and novels and things like that, I've determined that one of the most important skills you can possibly learn as a writer is how to pre-plan your characters and your world, okay? So let me give you sort of an example of this. We'll go with the Vampires Codex, right? So the Vampires Codex, before this book was ever even published as a role-playing game, it took probably about 6 months of pre-planning a world, okay? So when I say pre-planning world, it's like you're building a fictional setting from the ground up. Okay, and this is probably the most challenging thing writers do on a regular basis, at least people who make their own material, all right? Because, you kind of have to figure out, how does a certain character act, what would they do when they're in a certain setting, and then you're talking about, like, tone and, architecture of the world. And we'll cover a little bit about this in about maybe the next 30 minutes I'm talking about this. So, all right, so world building. So when you first start world building, you have to have a pretty clear vision of what your theme is going to be and where your genre is going. So you guys are all familiar with themes and genre, right? For the Vampires Codex in particular, what we wanted to do was we wanted to create we use the genre of vampire horror, gothic horror, to build a new setting, okay? So, it takes many many months of pre-writing just to get down what something looks like, okay? You kind of have to have the vision in your head, all right? And then before you go ahead and you start putting it onto paper, one of the things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to outline what this world looks like, all right? So usually when I start writing something, I start with sort of a vision statement. And as I've gotten more into film, we're using kind of the simple, what we call the elevator pitch in film, all right? Where if I were to describe this book in one sentence as far as a setting, I would say it's Underworld meets the Da Vinci Code. Okay, because those things are pretty clear-cut visuals in everybody's head. And once you have that kind of vision statement, that's where you start building. It's like it's like making a Lego block castle for all purposes. All right. So you start with the foundation, you just keep building it up. One of the major things that we talk about when we're world building is making sure things are rational. All right. So if you don't think it can physically happen in your world, like we also kind of call it the gravity of the world. All right. Because, when we're walking around on planet Earth, gravity is pretty constant. You're always going to stick to the ground. You're never going to float away. Things are always going to generally weigh the same. All right. And, when you're world building, you have to have that kind of gravity, okay? But you have to have it as far as sanity is concerned, okay? Because there's a lot of times people build worlds and they put things in the world that just make no sense whatsoever or can't be conceived to make sense. So if you can't suspend disbelief in some of the parts of the world that you're building, it's probably not a good thing to put that stuff in there. As I said, like everything has to maintain the gravity of your setting. All right, it has to, for example, like if you have airships in your setting, an airship is not a practical thing, at least as far as steampunk airships are concerned. Like you can't just take like a balloon and put helium in it and make a ship float in the sky. The mechanics of it turning would be impossible, okay, because you can't really use a rudder in midair. I mean, air doesn't work like that. But if you add things to your setting that anchors that or explains what you're doing, you have to have rationale for it, effectively, all right? A lot of that came in with Steam Fortress Victory, where we were running around trying to explain, how different aircraft, watercraft, how people would run around in a steampunk universe, with cars that were running on steam engines, or what we were calling them in the book were, I think they were like locomobiles. I think that's what we referred to them as. So, everything has to be anchored to the reality you're creating. And, this is one of the problems with world building is a lot of times when writers start building a world, they start going outside the bounds of this anchor, all right? When you start going outside the bounds of the anchor, your audience notices it, right? I mean, for example, let's take a look at Star Wars. You guys all, had seen Last Jedi and stuff like that, right? So when you saw, one of the biggest criticisms of that movie right now is when you see Luke not acting like Luke normally acted. So Luke Skywalker, you have 3 movies that tell you Luke Skywalker's mindset, right? And in The Last Jedi, it doesn't seem like he acted like Luke Skywalker. So that's what I'm talking about with world building and anchoring your setting, is that in the setting of Star Wars, and from what we know about Luke Skywalker and what he's been through, he was not acting rationally in Last Jedi, all right? And this is why I think a lot of the Star Wars fans had critical reviews of it. So, and this is probably the most important facet of world building, is to make sure that your setting, defines what the limits are that you can build into it, okay? So I talked a little bit about setting. The other thing your setting has to be fixed to is your genre. So if you choose a genre like vampires, steampunk, fantasy, for example, let's say you're doing a Dungeons and Dragons book, and you have dragons and you have goblins and what have you. There's probably no room for a Mack truck in Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so your setting tends to define where you are as far as what you can put in, or your genre tends to define what you can put in your setting. So once you've established your genre and your setting, and you've anchored to that as a writer, that's where you start building layers into the world. When we're building large settings, the Vampires Codex has a lot of layers to it. I mean, sometimes, one small detail can expand into 20 pages. For example, one of the things that expanded in the Vampires Codex was we were talking about as I remember having this conversation over the phone with the publisher at Fifth Epic, Vito Pandolfo. We were talking, we had like an hour-long conversation about how much blood a vampire would actually have to drink to sustain himself if he lived on blood, versus how many humans he would have to tap to get that blood without killing a human, right? So these are little nuances in the world. This became like a deep and real essay, right? So we're sitting there going, all right, so let's say vampires drink blood, all right? If a vampire is going to fill his belly with blood or fill his circulatory system with blood, he's going to have fresh blood 4 pints or so every day-ish. So, and if you think about how many pints, a human has, and even if we were cutting it down to like, let's say the vampire needed 1 week or 1 pint a week to sustain himself. That's still a lot of humans you got to go tap for blood, okay? So, it's like one of those things where like your lore has to be consistent with your setting and genre. I mean, like little minute details layer up into that type of thing, right? So there's actually like an entire 2 or 3 pages just on how vampires drink blood in this. And I mean, that was really the basis of this book too, is that we were trying to set a lot of vampire lore straight. Because if you watch enough Dracula movies and you watch like Underworld, you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily consistent across the board. For example, in different Dracula movies, sometimes Dracula is allergic to silver, sometimes he's not allergic to silver. I mean, and sometimes he's allergic to garlic, sometimes he's not allergic to garlic. Sometimes he has issues with crosses, sometimes he's fine. It's that sort of consistency that has to be built into your layers. Another one out of this book was, how does the human mind deal with relationships if you live 500 years? We don't have any basis for that. Like, you would have to, as I said, like, average human relationship probably lasts about 30 years total, and that's with like just friends. I mean, how many times do you turn over friends in like 10 years, but to live 500 years, go through multiple wives, multiple friends, multiple associates, how would that affect a character, right? And which is kind of the lead into my next part. So you put the base of the world down, which is the setting and the genre, and then you move up a level. You start adding in facets that that explain what's going on in your genre and setting. The third layer up is where you start adding characters into it. All right, so characters really don't come until about 3 deep into this process. And this is, and maybe even you could put like as sort of like a layer 1/2 or something, or 1.5, you could put like general philosophical, because there's sometimes a lot of people in their themes like to add, philosophical discourses into it. So, for example, Star Wars, we'll go back to that. Like the original Star Wars movies, the main theme of Star Wars is man versus machine, okay? Like there's nothing outside of that really defines Star Wars, okay? But George Lucas, in the middle of that man versus machine theme, started inserting various views he had on the world. For example, one of the views he added in there was his general views on religion, which is how the Force works. So like the Force, it's black and white, good, evil. There's not really an in-between thing. It's not a major theme of Star Wars, but it is something that's kind of like a philosophical embedding in Star Wars, okay? So, I mean, he and then later, he decided to backtrack on it and put like midichlorians and stuff in it, and that got all strange. But in general, there's these little philosophical layers you put into the theme. So when you get to the character level of world building, that's where stuff starts getting really complicated, because you're going from the macro, which is usually what you start with, to the micro, all right? So you're going from, building a setting and a genre, which you've added layers to, and you've added flavor to through, your philosophy, theme, discourses, what have you. And now you're actually adding snapshots of what individual perspectives of the world look like. This has always been probably my best advice for any writer, is that if you build a macro world like I'm talking about, it's easier to build the macro world, put it aside, and then start creating snapshots of that world from perspectives of characters, okay? Because once you've built a world, I mean, worlds are vast. These things can take 2-3 years to put together. As you get down to the character level, you may even find out that characters themselves can be entire novels, okay? You know, it's like I kind of also like reference the Hunger Games in this perspective too. I mean, there's you could do entire novels on just each individual character in the Harry Potter's another one like that, right? Where, you know, the Harry Potter novels are generally about Harry Potter, but as J.K. Rowling's going back and doing now with Fantastic Beasts, she's doing like entire novels just about what happened to Dumbledore, or, you know, stuff like that. So, you know, as I said, you got to be fully aware when you're building a world that you build characters into the world, that each of those characters could be their own snapshot, perhaps even a product or a novel. You know, whether or not you have time to write all of these things is, you know, totally beyond the scope of this discussion, but let's say you did, all right? If you've built the world correctly and you've put those 3 layers in, where you've added a setting, you've created a genre with themes and sub-themes, and then you have finally gotten down to characters, you know, like when you get to the character point, that's where you just start writing stories. And all those stories will compile into snapshots of your world from different perspectives, and, you know, it'll just sort of enrich the world. So that's kind of where world building goes, all right? And that's, you know, kind of what I want to do a little writer's talk on about here. And thank you all for listening. If you guys have any questions about anything I was saying here, you can check out my booth over there. We are 20 Eyes Entertainment. Oh, one other thing I want to add in before I sort of step off this topic is that when you're doing this for movies, all right, by the time you've got to the 3rd layer of world building, which is the characters, like the movie, like when you write screenplays, the movie should almost entirely be around the snapshots of the characters' perspectives. And ideally, it should be only following 1 or 2 characters. There's a lot of movies I've seen lately that try to follow like 9 characters at a time or something like that, and things just get confusing and people don't get developed. You know, what was I watching recently? There was something that they came, like, you know, like Avengers movies, right? Or Justice League, stuff like that. Like, each of those characters in Avengers, as Disney has figured out, can have their own line of movies. When you put them all together in a team for the first time, you know, stuff like Hawkeye doesn't get developed all that much. Or Black Widow sort of gets half developed, things like that. So for screenplays, ideally you want to pick 1 to 3 characters within your world genre to expand on into an actual screenplay. Like, you don't want to broaden the scope too much, okay? So that's, you know, the basics of world building right there. You lay down your setting, you move up to a genre and themes, and then you start inserting snapshots of characters' lives into that. And, you know I said that really easily in a sentence, but it takes a long time to do. So, but I hope to help you guys out a little bit with maybe you're considering your writing. And, you know, if you have any questions for me, feel free. You know, I'll take a couple now if you guys have anything you want to ask me. Anything? Nope, you're all good. Excellent. All right. So I will, you know, conclude the panel here. And I'll be over at my table if you guys want to talk to me about anything. And, you know, I'll be happy to answer questions. All right. Thank you.